I think it's freed up a lot of organizations that used to see working from home as a challenge to productivity to thinking about that in a different way. So it's freed up possibilities. As a species, we tend to kind of bounce between different polar opposites, and I'd say remote working and everyone in the office are two of those opposites. We need to work out for each company.
We have the pleasure of welcoming David today to our interview series. I'm Sumita Mariam from the peopleHum team. Before we begin, just a quick introduction of peopleHum. peopleHum is an end-to-end, one-view, integrated human capital management automation platform, the winner of the 2019 Global Cody Award for HCM that is specifically built for crafted employee experiences and the future of work, with automation and AI technologies. We run the peopleHum blog and the video channel, which receives upwards of 200,000 visitors a year, and publish around 2 interviews with well-known names globally every month. And now for our guest. David Souza is the membership director at CIPD with over 150,000 members committed to championing better work and working lives. He leads a range of business areas, including membership development, customer service, and professional networks. He's also a regular keynote speaker and writer on people and the world of work, focusing on the links between behavioral science and HR. He has been featured in industry and national media, including the BBC, Forbes, and The Guardian. We are happy to have someone of his stature to share his views with us today. Welcome, David. We're thrilled to have you.
Delighted to be here. Very excited for whatever the next part of the conversation brings.
Great. So moving on to our questions, David. The first question I would like to ask you is that how do you see the changes that technology brings, changing the way we work and the skill sets that we need in order to keep up with the disruption that is expected with the advancement of, automation and AI?
Well, it's a really interesting time to be talking about this because obviously we're in lockdown, as much of the world is. And I think lots of the conversations that have taken place around technology over the last few years have been theoretical conversations. Theoretically, we could all work from home. Theoretically, we could all collaborate in different ways using different technology. And now what we're seeing is lots of people being forced into that behavior very rapidly and accelerating through that change curve of adoption. So I think I've been talking for years about automation and the impact on workplaces and workforces and the way that we live. But actually the way that we live has completely changed over the last few weeks. The key thing around automation is understanding the uneven distribution of the impact that it will have. So there are a few things when you come to talk about technology. Just because it exists, it doesn't mean that we use it. And we know that there are lots of technologies that we don't use to their full potential, or that we've had for years, but they haven't proved to be cost effective. There's a really interesting example here in the UK of if you went back 20 years, we'd have automatic car washes. Now, actually, there are lots more hand car washes because labour has become so cheap that it's cheaper to utilise that than elsewhere. So just because automation is possible doesn't mean it will happen. But what we are seeing, particularly in HR, is that lots of the, I suppose what would be called low value processes, ones that need to be done accurately but need to be repeated, are far easier to automate than they have been before. And then you move into the province of starting to automate or inform better decision making. And that's the challenge that I think we face internally in HR. Across workforces in general, you're looking at broader automation of particularly manual tasks. You see that whether that's in warehouses, whether that's the advances that you have in self-driving technology. As we move closer to that space, you have a fundamental imbalance in the skills that you need in the economy. So people are talking about the need for data scientists, for instance. Well, it's not the case that the person who was driving your taxi last week is likely to be moving into data science rapidly. So we need to think about the flexibility of the workforces that we have as well. So just because jobs are created in one place, doesn't mean that they'll be filled by the people that are being displaced in other areas. So it's a really exciting time to be alive. We have the ability to solve lots of problems through automation, including problems to do with the quality of work. But we need to make sure that we're doing that in a mindful fashion and that people are seen as being at the center of that rather than just being an adjunct to that. Because if there's one thing that is clear from the current crisis, it's how much organizations genuinely do rely on their people, on the thinking and creativity of their people, and the flexibility of their people. And that's hard to get from a system.
Yeah, that's a wonderful answer. I think we're all very much relied on technology right now, and there has to be a fine balance between people and tech for everything to work out perfectly well. So, with the pandemic going on, what changes do you picture in the idea of the ideal workplace once we're out of this crisis? What do you think is going to be the new normal?
I think the phrase new normal is a really interesting one. I was reading recently actually it was about nuclear war, so it was even worse than the current situation, but it talked about the new abnormal. And I think we're going to have potentially a few years of a really different way of living, and a different way of understanding our connections to each other and our connections to work. So I think what we need to decide actively, because I think there are different pathways we could go down, what we need to decide actively is how much of this new way of working we want to keep and we want to make sure that we protect, and how much of it actually we need to go back to the way that we were. I think one of the challenges is that people talk about this as a positive shift that we've made in terms of utilization of technology, and people working remotely. But at the crux of flexible working and collaboration is the ability to come together in a number of different ways that suit your preference. Whereas at the moment, we're all just trapped in our houses having to use technology. So there's a massive difference. And at the heart of good working practice is choice and autonomy for the individuals. And at the moment, we've seen some of the greatest oppression, repression, pressure on individual choice that most of us will have known in our lifetimes. So I think lots of people are right in saying that the world will be different. We need to factor in that that's not just working practices, that's the economic impact of this as well. So I regularly get asked by HR practitioners, what will be the biggest change for HR over the coming years? And my stock and quite lazy answer is normally it will be something external that we haven't seen coming, like the financial crash, like a war. And tragically, in this case, it's a pandemic, and that is shifting and forcing changes in the way that we view work. But also the idea that we will just come out of this in 6 months' time and everything will go back to the way it was doesn't represent the level of economic damage and challenge that we have. So we're moving into an era not just of how we use technology in a different way, but how we think about people's relationship with the workplace, how we think about employers' obligations to the people that work for them. We've been talking for years about things like employer brand. This is the real test of that. If you really believe in that, then what you do in these months matters. But we also have there is no space for fluffiness. The economic reality of this is biting. So there's a lovely quote from a journalist called John Stewart. He says, if you don't stick to your principles when times are tough, they're not principles, they're hobbies. And I think we're going through a period where we're really going to test how much of what organizations said about how much they care about their people and how they want to operate is true, and how much of that was just a nice branding statement because it was possible, because they had the money and the economic conditions to provide it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think once we come out of this crisis, the one question that candidates will have to ask, their interview panel would be, what did you do during the crisis? How did you take care of your employees? So that's a very valid point. So just out of curiosity, I just wanted to ask you, so there are a lot of organizations that are right now saying that, everything's perfect when people are working from home. So why do we want to invest in buildings? So what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's freed up a lot of organizations that used to see working from home as a challenge to productivity to thinking about that in a different way. So it's freed up possibilities, but within possibilities, you always have choice. So I think for lots of people at the moment, they're finding working from home very difficult. It will be challenging either because of the amount of space that they have available to do it, or that actually they have family around them, and that's a difficult environment to work in. So I think it's likely that there'll be less demand for kind of concrete real estate in kind of centralized business districts in the same way that it has. You can see a drop there. But I think the idea that everything will change belies the fact that actually people like getting together, they like collaborating face to face. I know lots of people are already missing the office in a way that they didn't think they would. And again, it comes down to the fact that currently this isn't a choice, this is enforced. And where people settle when they have the choice will be the most interesting way of doing it. Not to mention the fact that lots of parts of the economy rely on being face-to-face and having a physical presence. So for knowledge workers, this is a very different scenario. But if you work serving coffee, or you work on a manufacturing, or you work in construction, remote work isn't a very it's not a great concept for you. So I think we need to make sure that we think about the economy in the round. But also, I think whilst it has opened up many organisations' eyes to what's possible, if they just shift to that being compulsory, or if they make that move purely on the grounds of cost saving, rather than thinking about what's the best way for people to work, be productive and feel part of the community, then potentially we just end up with a cyclical piece where everyone starts working from home, and then in a few years' time, they're missing the connections, and you have pioneering organizations that build offices. And that seems a strange way for us to go. So as a species, we tend to kind of bounce between different polar opposites. And I'd say remote working and everyone in the office are two of those opposites. We need to work out for each company and for each person, ideally, because that's the nature of choice. What are the options that sit in there? Yeah, and you'd expect that to be the case in offices as well. So different areas of the office where, depending on the nature of the work you need to do, there's different spaces you can access. So I think whether you want to work from home, whether you want to work from a park, a coffee shop, a library, the challenge is actually how do you free people up to work in the place that's going to be most productive for them? And if organizations can make that shift by having a bit more trust in people, then actually that will be a positive to come from a very bad situation.
Yeah, I think that is something that we are going to learn from this particular situation. Organizations have to trust more and delegate more while they're working from home. So yeah, so moving a shift to evidence-based management. So what do you think are the critical components that organizations need to consider when developing an evidence-based model?
The key to evidence-based management or an evidence-based approach is humility, because it's really easy for us to understand and believe that the things that we're doing have been adding value because we've worked really hard on them. So the best way of kind of adopting an evidence-based approach is to think really systematically about what's the best way of us getting an answer that's most likely to be the right answer in this situation. It's not about truth. That's a really difficult concept. But actually, have we looked at enough things from enough angles with enough openness to be able to say that we've evaluated the options properly and that we're willing to declare that we've made a mistake if things aren't going our way? So I always say, with the amount of L&D teams that I've worked with over the years that have claimed incredible return on investment, every company would be the size of Google if they were all true. And that's because we try and shift facts, or we try and shift figures, certainly, to prove us right. So start with a structured approach, set time aside before you commit to any action to evaluate what research is there, what do you understand from your own experience, what does the organization's data tell you about the situation that you're currently in, and then work through and build a hypothesis about what you're going to do. And it doesn't need to take long. It could be, if you've only got half an hour, take half an hour, but go, what do we genuinely know about this situation? What should we be doing? Come up with a plan and then test that hypothesis. And it's not, people see that as a slower process, but actually it's far faster than spending a year on something and then realizing you haven't made the difference that you'd like to. And so many HR directors that I speak to, if you ask them to review last year's plan, they'll be really proud of the work that their team has done, and they'll be able to point to some things that they feel they've achieved, but quite often they haven't made the shift in the organization that they would have wanted to. And evidence-based management provides a framework for you to be able to do that. So we've got some good resources at the CIPD on it, but also there's an organization called SEBMA, the Center for Evidence-Based Management. Go on their website and they've got some free tools you can look at that help build that kind of approach for you. But humility is the key, humility and curiosity.
That's a wonderful concept. So how do you think, the employee expectations from the workplace has changed over the years? I mean, if they have changed, what do you think are the factors that have contributed to the change?
It's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, there's a raft of research out there about generational differences, and then there's a counter raft of research about actually how those are overblown. If I think back over my career, I think our expectations of technology in the workplace have fundamentally changed, and people's skills around those. I think there's a growing focus on environmental impact in lots of workplaces, and an expectation that organizations operate in an ethical way. And I think social media has actually driven lots of those changes. So it used to be, if you were a slightly evil company, you could probably get away with that for a relatively long amount of time. What we've seen now is that things come out into the open far more often. If you're treating your employees badly, sites like Glassdoor and others will provide an insight into that. So I think you asked a really interesting question earlier, or you made a suggestion that after this, people will be asking in interviews, how did you treat your people during this crisis? I don't think they'll be asking that in interviews. I think they'll be looking for evidence. You know, they'll be talking to people who work there already, saying, how were you treated? Which is a really different dynamic. And the way we communicate has fundamentally changed and shifted. The way that the amount of connections that people have, and I know they call them friends on Facebook, but they're probably not that. The amount of connections we have and the access to data is really different. And that, I think, changes the way that people evaluate organizations quite fundamentally. I think there are some overblown suggestions around, certainly in the UK, we had this notion of job for life, that, you know, once you enter an organization, you stay there forever, but now millennials are just shifting from one job to another every week. The research behind that would suggest that that isn't true. I think what has happened is the people doing that research have got older. And people like me have got older, and so we feel more stable, and it looks as though people coming into the workforce are in flux. I think what's an interesting question to ask at any point in time is, how much do human beings stay the same? And I think it's not hugely different. I think maybe there's slightly more challenge in the system, and we get that from some of the dynamics and the fact that people have voices in different ways and spaces. But if you ask people 30 years ago, would you like a career that offered you development, stimulation, to work for someone that inspired you, and to work for an organization doing good things? They wouldn't have turned you down now then, and I don't think anyone would turn you down now. So I think we can overplay the differences, and actually the similarities are relatively consistent. And what's interesting is we still have organizations failing to deliver on those basic things now. Failing to be transparent around pay, to be transparent around progression, and to provide a good quality of working care for people. That was a challenge 30 years ago, 50 years ago, still a challenge today, probably will be tomorrow. It's easier to start from a blank sheet of paper and build something than it is to change some of the corporate monoliths that we know exist. So if you have, 200,000 employees, getting them to have a really different relationship with each other in the organization, it's far more challenging than three of you sitting in an office and going, what are we going to build here? So I think that is absolutely doubtless the case. But I think you also see some genuine shifts from some of the larger organizations. But if you want to look for, the easiest way to do it is to not have inbuilt habits or behaviors that already exist, and to start from afresh. But it is absolutely possible to change some of the more enduring organizations as well. And they're some of the most interesting challenges for HR practitioners, is not to, just work in a startup because it's exciting and you can build whatever you like, but actually to take a large organization or a historic organization and take it through phases of change and modernize it, because that involves a different skill set. So I think they're both challenges. I think you're absolutely right in calling out that it's probably harder to do it if you've got ingrained behaviors, but that's part of the charm and the challenge.
Yeah, so we were talking a lot about the millennial workforce, and we are seeing a rise in the gig workers right now. It's not just delivery boys or coffee servers who are gig workers anymore. We have like more executives who are like, let's work for 6 months and take a break for another 3 months. So with the rise in the gig economy, how do you think this is going to fit in the organizational setup that we have right now? What do you think is the future of the gig economy?
I think it's fundamentally changed over the last month. I think you can imagine over the next few years that security of income and confidence in income will be a prime driver for people in a period of what may not just be recession, but maybe depression. So people are talking about this being the biggest global crisis since the Second World War. In that case, continuity of income will be a huge driver for people in a way that it hasn't been before. So I think in the UK, certainly the recent crisis has raised questions over people's rights and expectations as gig workers. And there's an appreciation of how diminished those rights are compared to some people in the permanent workforce. But whereas people, in some gig work would have preferred it due to flexibility, the flexibility only really works for people if they're confident that they're going to be able to get work. Where work is scarce, actually that's a highly competitive environment and you want to secure that. So I think similar to some of the conversations around disruption, we've had actual disruption now, and I think it will disrupt the gig economy in a very different way. And I would hope that there'll be more governmental pressure and societal pressure to ensure that people working in insecure roles have better security actually in terms of their provision and care. But I also think the preference for that type of work will probably diminish just because you want to work for an organisation that you know is going to exist in 3 months' time, 6 months' time, or to have the best confidence that it will.
Yeah, I think everyone wants that security right now. Like after we come out of this also, being secure, being financially secure is going to be one of the prime concerns. So for designing a good employee experience, we need a great organizational culture. So how would you advise organizations to, if you can give them a few pointers on how to build a good organizational culture, what would they be?
I think the best way to get a good organizational culture, if there is such a thing, because culture should be fit for purpose for the organization and its challenges, is just to be really open to listening. And it's probably not even more complicated than that. I think clarity of communication and ability to listen and respond are probably the key things that are going on in any organization. Listening gets you good ideas. Listening gets you an understanding of the context people are working in. Listening gets you the ability to change and adapt your working practices to make sure that they are allowing people to be productive and to contribute. In the absence of listening, all you have is the culture that the senior members of the organisation would like to see. And the distance between those two things can quite often be great. And you went back to the example of people working in organisations with outdated working practices. That's a lack of ability to listen and respond. Or it's an arrogance in believing that there's a right way to do things. So I think organisations that are open to challenge and to reflect on themselves tend to have the healthiest culture because it's most reflective of the way that people want and need to work. And there have been some really interesting models over the last few years of organisations being incredibly open in the way that they work. And I think, again, that you've got those polar pieces between organisations going, everyone's got complete autonomy over here, and organisations with command and control. And what's healthiest is finding the balance that works for the organisation at that time. But I think, people say that you can't define culture. You can. There are lots of really good and useful definitions of culture. So all I'd say is to anyone concerned about organizational culture, do the background work, read some books, speak to some people, listen. But your organizational culture isn't what you laminate and put up on the wall. It's what people say when they don't think the boss is about. And as soon as you understand that, you understand the power of voice and opening it up. I spent a large chunk of the last year taking every single person who reports in any of my teams out for coffee one by one to kind of go, how am I doing? And to learn from them, but also to break down, you'll never get all of it, but to break down some of that gap between being in a leadership position and being someone who feels they don't have a proportionate voice. If you accept that the best ideas in an organization aren't likely to come from the CEO waking up one day and going, huzzah, I have a great idea, but it's the strength of all of the people in the organization thinking about and caring about the same goal, then you have to open up people's voice. as effectively as you can and be absolutely passionate about that. And what I would say is, bizarrely, whatever you think about the culture at Amazon, and I know people will have really mixed feelings about that, if you look at their kind of cultural guidelines and their principles for operating, most organizations would benefit from them. So that are absolutely passionate about the customer, and also their kind of disagree and commit philosophy, which is to have open conversations around data and information, but then say we're doing this all together. There's some really interesting things out there. So we've never had a greater ability to look into other organizations and analyze their cultures and see what works and what doesn't. We've also had probably, we've never had more hype about organizations and how great they are. And normally what you find is after a few years they fail and everyone goes, I could have seen that coming. And just keep listening to your own people and keep listening to your customers. It's never going to go too far wrong.
Yeah, I definitely think the people contribute to the, culture that an organization is, like the forefront of an organization is the people. So definitely, yes. So, David, if there's any, last sound bites that you would like to leave our audience.
Lots of things you would have heard from experts over the last few years are now either irrelevant or they're more relevant than they've ever been. I think there's some work that everyone needs to do to work out which is which. Because for everyone that was talking about the upcoming disruption, we've had it now. We've had a large part of it, but we have to enable people to make a choice. And societally and in organizations, we have to make the right choices. Otherwise, we will go back to a set of working practices that were already outdated. So we have the opportunity to harness technology, to think really hard about the ways of working within organizations, and to think about what really matters as people and as organizations. And so I'll come back to that point about listening. Voice in organizations will never have been more important. The ability to connect with each other and have support will never have been more important. But also the understanding that people's lives don't start and end with their day at the office. But we've seen, I can see into your lovely home there. I can see, the things going on in the background. People have characters and families and things they care about way outside of the office. And we've spoken for a number of years about the fact that, work and life are now starting to blend. That's obviously the case for people now. And you will see colleagues, if you work in large organizations or even small ones, that will probably suffer bereavements or challenges or financial hardship. How we step up together to address those issues over the next few years determines not just the worth of organizations, but the worth of us as HR practitioners and experts.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And thank you so much for coming to our interview. I had personally a very enriching experience, and I'm sure all your insights are going to help our viewers too. So thank you so much for being on our interview, and let's keep in touch.
Lovely to talk to you. Thank you very much.